I managed to come up with a lot about Steve, although I kind of struggled to come up with all those little specific things that went into him. It's more of a, maybe the historian will come out in me. It's kind of a chronological approach, a review of my experiences and what kind of just stands out, and hopefully it brings in some of the family as well. But anyway, this is my best shot. There we go. So in the beginning, I don't know if Steve's artwork is here. In the corner here is this little castle thing, you may be wondering, with some great hand-painted toy soldiers. And that's kind of the origin story for me and Steve, because we were kind of bound at the beginning. Our Grandpa Duffe, was a very handy person. So, and I found out only recently, he got it for Christmas. And my birthday is on December 26th, the day after Christmas. So recently I found out not only did he get it on Christmas, he got it Christmas of 1955, and I was born the next day, which I just recently figured out, that's St. Stephen's Day. So we were kind of bound together at the very beginning, it seemed. But the toy soldiers were important because Steve did say to me once, Marion alluded to all his artistic inclinations, those hand-painted soldiers were his first great aesthetic experience. So, at about age 5 or 6, we lived on Flora Place. We had one of those big houses. My brother's up the block, has another one of those big houses. But Steve had the big, I'm calling it the lair on the 3rd floor, the biggest room in the house. And he was probably, when I was 5 or 6, he would have been 16 or 17. He moved on beyond the soldiers, but I was just starting to get interested in the soldiers. So he had the big room, and there was storage room, and that had the castle and his soldiers. And so that was it. I was always up there wanting to play with those. And Steve had moved on to what I call, the company that made those soldiers was called Britons. And I'd say he moved from Britons to Beethoven. and by the time he was 16 or 17. So that was my entree, because the big room next door it was already a collection of, he had the record player, and the classical record collection was starting, and the art books, philosophy books. Anyway, even at a very young age, I was introduced to a world of culture, art, music. I have a copy I'm going to get here, because he always said, as we know, he liked, as Bob's poem alluded to, acquisitive. This was his first Beethoven's 9th Symphony, and I can remember this. And he said when his shopping forays, no matter how many copies he saw, he always bought it. Couldn't have too many. And as I found going through his collection, there's multiples of many things. So as I said, that was kind of he had tapes of poet Dylan Thomas reading poetry on A Child's Christmas in Wales, and T.S. Eliot, and the books. And anyway, that was my introduction. And even though I think he must have gone east when I was about 11, I guess I already had kind of a pretty good liberal arts education, thanks to Steve at a very young age. So I'm trying to think how I organize this. Then I'm going to go into what I'm called the New England years, when Steve went, as Marion said, he went into volunteers and service to America. I think that's what VISTA stood for. It's now known as AmeriCorps. It's kind of the domestic Peace Corps. And I guess my first memory of the visit is Bill was in the Navy at Newport. I guess it was 1967, my first child was about to be born, and I think that's the first time we crossed paths with Steve was in Newport. And we're on vacation. This was Steve, even though when we lived apart, it was always just kind of an adventurous, magical space when I was with Steve. That was kind of a constant in our life. I can remember some other visits. He had this hovel in Providence he lived in. And the only furniture I remember, he had a new KLH stereo system that, again, still had all the music. I guess the greatest summer was, well, I remember him visiting back to the RISD when he was there in school there and visiting him, and I was a young teenager and hanging out with all these college people, interesting artistic types, and I felt very sophisticated for my age, thanks for that. So again, it was always, when I was with Steve, it was always a special space. I guess that's kind of a theme. And I guess the big stay was in the summer of '75. He was a security guard at the Gardner Museum. I don't know if anybody knows. It's a small museum in Boston. And so literally again, thanks to Steve, I was surrounded by art because we were on the night shift, and I remember crawling through in the dead of night with a flashlight and something we had to clock in. And anyway, the Vermeer and the Rembrandt were safe while we were there. It wasn't the case. Some of you know what I'm talking about. And no, we don't have it downstairs. Steve was back here by then, at the time that heist happened. Just so you know, don't go looking for him down there. So in 1980, I guess our paths kind of crossed again. A whole lot of things happened around that time. That Steve had come back to take care of our mother, who had cancer at the time, and I don't know, other people may be able to tell it better. The firehouse, they were in Seattle then, and a firehouse all of a sudden came on the scene. They were looking for a place to live. Interesting, and I don't know if you want to talk about caught your eye, and that drew him back. And in '80, I was moving. I was here in the summer for a while before I went up to Wisconsin, where I ended up spending the next 40 years. I went to grad school, and I had a career in state government. But anyway, there was kind of a confluence there in 1980 where our paths crossed. And then began, I guess, a very long period where I was in Wisconsin. I got out of the grad school in '83, and let's see, unfortunately our father, I think in '81, had a stroke and he died a year later. Our grandma Duffe, who was the one grandparent we had the longest, she lasted till 1986, and I began a routine where I would be coming down here about 4 times a year, and of course it was always for the holidays, Christmas especially. I would pick up Grandma Duffe and bring her down, and I'm trying to think how to even summarize all those 40 years. I guess Christmas was a big deal, because Steve's mischievous inner child excelled at that time of year. And it all went back, I'll go back, another wonderful memory I have of Steve, back to the toy soldiers. It was about when I was 7, and I was still in the Santa Claus years, believing in Santa Claus. And coming down to my Santa Claus gift, and that was 1962, and everybody wanted the Civil War battleground play set. And so I came downstairs, but it wasn't just in the box under the tree. Steve had set it all up sort of like like you'd see a famous department store diorama all set up. For some reason, that stood out as like the greatest Christmas. just one of those little inexplicable things that stayed with me my entire life. In fact, I had to remind you, say, did I do that? I don't remember. I don't know. Bill or Jim, you didn't do that, did you?
No.
Okay. It was Steve. But anyway, he was the perfect guy to do that. I'm trying to think, there was just another example of his whimsy. There was this, Steve area. Now we didn't get the battery, but there was one Christmas when he found this. Oh no. We didn't get the battery. If you pushed it, it croaks jingle bells. So Steve, and this was, there was a shop, I remember it was near Arsenal and Grand that had them. I think he bought them out of everyone that had them. Everybody got one. So this is the one that has survived. But there's hundreds of things like that associated with Steve. And I'm sort of frustrated that there's only a few I seem to be able to remember, other than the broad sweep of history with my brother. I'm just trying to remember. The family gatherings were great. I mean, Bill and Michelle's house has been central, but we've had great meals here, and Jim and Mary's, unfortunately. We should note that Jim was brother number 3, and we lost him over 20 years ago, and Mary was supposed to be here, but I found out her knees just weren't cooperating, so she couldn't be here. But I did want to remember other brother who passed quite a while ago. But we had great times at their house here. And another great memory I have, and I'm sure I met some of you was another big ritual was the meals around, they could be in here if it were a bigger event, but the other, Steve and Mary, and I told people I always knew I was going to get well fed when I went to St. Louis, because that was another great thing that Steve introduced to the family was good food. We were kind of a meat and potatoes, and all of a sudden I remember Steve was introducing Chinese cooking with Joyce Chen. You didn't mention pesto, did you?
No, I didn't.
You were going to cut
But
it
it's
all.
out there.
It's out there. I remember there was another thing I remember on my Boston visit that Steve had kind of discovered pesto in the 70s before it became all the rage. So we had this wonderful standard meal. I remember we had at the house when I stayed with you when I worked at the museum. He made it from fresh basil, and there was the Italian markets, and he'd always get the fresh cheese, and he'd buy fresh pasta. It wasn't just out of a box. Actually, there was a market where you could buy the fresh stuff, and he'd get fresh fish from the market. And anyway, just another example of his glorious cooking, and that was a whole other thing he brought to the family. Interesting food. That's another, and I have met many of you here around tables and great conversation, and just one of those little things I remember at the end of the meal, Steve would say, would anybody like a cup of coffee? Because that was another one of his great pleasures. I was hoping to have many more years of the sharing a morning cup of coffee. Stars Blend, highly recommended. So, anyway, I'm trying out a little bit here. Oh, the Soulard. Now we got to mention Soulard. Since the food went trips to Soulard, and it was always kind of both fascinating and frustrating to go to Soulard with Steve because he did have a tendency to overbuy things. So there was this, what's that cheer thing? Everybody knows your name. Well, that was Soulard. Everybody knows Steve's name. Because you would go down the aisle, Steve, and they'd be waving some big tray of something that Steve would bring home, and Mary would go, Steve, what are we going to do with all this stuff? Out would come the cookbooks, and somehow she would manage to salvage at least some of it, although she did note that now that Steve's gone, there is a lot less compost. But I would be happy to live with the additional compost. Oh, I love it. I remember I was trying to restrain Steve once. Steve, do you really need, don't you have a couple of bags of that at home? And he just didn't hear me. And I told that to Mary, and she came back, she said, yeah, I tried that once, and the vendor looked at her and said, lady, you're wasting your time. Anyway, that's just one of a zillion stories you could tell about Steve that just went into this kind of, you were just in a different space with you. But anyway, my visits usually, music was of course a big thing. If I had time to write, we'd go to the symphony with Ariana Quartet, who's here. Steve, another big theme in his Indian classical music. He introduced me to that, and he was even on the board. There's a Indian classical music society called Sangeeta, and actually Mary and I just went to one of their concerts. But then he had a great friend called Imran Khan, a wonderful local sitar and Subaru player that I remember going to concerts. And another thing, I'm really into Irish music, so starting in the 90s, they have a great Irish music weekend. It kind of moves around in April, and I'd come down with my, and sometimes I'd be joined with my friend Chelsea and her husband Bill, would make it down, and we had some great weekends. I noticed Steve had a comment, I introduced him to a lot of traditional music. And Irish said, I like that Irish, those people know how to have a good time when they play music. So we had a great, there'd be a concert at Sheldon, and then the whole family would gather at McGurk's pub on Sundays for the big session. And otherwise there were trips to, we usually got in and walked to Shaw's Garden and revisit, and we particularly like the Japanese garden, so a lot of memories there with Steve. These were the things he loved, and of course the art museum, particularly if there was a special show going on. And we had some great vacations together out west. One time I know Andrew was here, we visited in San Diego, we had to drive up the coast. We had another one, we did the big Yosemite, and I think in 2019 we rendezvoused, they had a big cruise, and we rendezvoused at Wiesbaden where Andrew lives and had a cruise on the river, and anyway, it was just lots of great memories like that. I could bore you for a lot longer, but I think it kind of, like for most of the things, kind of came to a screeching halt, and we had a big trip planned in May of 2020 that, like a lot of people, that wasn't going to happen. So I do want to, now Bob got into it very poetically, and I'm going to go have a section I'm calling Steve's Stuff. I'm calling, instead of the 800-pound gorilla in the room, it's the 800 tons downstairs. It's the 40 years of acquisitions. And in fact, I remember at Christmas, I think the brothers stopped giving each other gifts because we just buy, in fact, Steve said, I'm buying myself presents all the time. As is, you will much in evidence downstairs. He says, why wait for Christmas? And I do remember my phone call, we communicate by phone since I was up in Wisconsin. But our phone calls did seem like I'd get off the phone, I'd say, seems like we spend about 2/3 of the time talking about the books, the records he recently bought. And it was kind of a pattern. He'd tell me about them, and then the next visit they'd be piled up on the table out there, and we'd go through them, and company would be coming, and they'd have to get cleared off, and then they'd get boxed and downstairs, and I'd say, Steve, where's that book or whatever you showed me? Oh, it's down there somewhere. So, but I did kind of understand what all that stuff was about. All those books and records were Steve's way of trying to capture all the beautiful and interesting in the world, whether it was music, literature, history, philosophy, you name it, he had it. It was kind of his own little library of Alexandria, I'm calling it. But I would pick up things like, okay, volume 6 of, Great Sea Fish of the World, the Eastern Caribbean, and I'd say, really, Steve? But the one that got me was he'd have like language shapes, and I said, are you really going to teach yourself Brazilian Portuguese, Steve? Let's get real here. And he said, I think I did go back to St. Dennis. I think I might have gotten to him on that one. But what really got me is more recently, I would say, he'd bring in the latest pile. He thought he was sneaking into the house without Marion's knowledge. That was kind of a joke. And I said, Steve, I hope it's a long way off, but someday somebody's going to have to deal with all this stuff. And his response was, John, someday it'll all be yours. And now it is. Now, he did mention the great potlatch was, I think, a Northwest Indian giveaway where you just gave away stuff. And I have sorted through his compact discs, so if any of you are looking to augment your classical CD collection, just talk to me and I can lead you to the right box downstairs. So started to deal with pieces of the collection. Oh, and another thing in the purchasing, that was what Bill and I